Welcome to Hockey Whiz Talks podcast. Today I'll be talking about NHL trade deadline impact in fantasy hockey. In this podcast, I discuss the impact the NHL trade deadline may have on fantasy hockey. How trades at the deadline affects fantasy value. The fantasy value of a player can be positively affected if they are dealt to a contending team. On the contrary, if the player is traded to a team that they don't fit well on, it can actually negatively affect their fantasy value. And now a word from our sponsor. Check out my scouting blog at hockeywiz777scouting.com. Listen to my scouting blog podcast on anchor.fm/hockeywiz777. Top players who could be traded. Claude Giroux. Claude Giroux is likely to be traded to a contending team at the deadline, so his fantasy value is going to skyrocket when he finally gets surrounded by some good players. Marc-Andre Fleury. Marc-Andre Fleury may be dealt at the deadline to a contender. However, depending on which team he gets traded to, it may not exactly improve his fantasy value. JT Miller. JT Miller might be on the move at the deadline, which may actually be bad for his fantasy value, as he might not be as important to the team he gets traded to as he is to the Vancouver Canucks. Jacob Chichurin. Jacob Chichurin is still likely to be traded at the deadline despite being injured. His fantasy stock will go up if he is dealt to a contending team. John Klingberg. John Klingberg is going to be an impact defenseman regardless of whether he stays in Dallas or gets traded. However, if he is moved to a new team, Klingberg could see his value skyrocket as a result of a change in scenery. Phil Kessel. Phil Kessel hasn't been a highly coveted fantasy player for a long time, but that all could change if he is traded to a contending team at the deadline, as he has proven that he is capable of producing alongside star players, so his fantasy value should go up. Semyon Varlamov. Semyon Varlamov is not worth owning in fantasy as long as he's still with the Islanders, but if he's moved to another team, his value should go up tremendously. Check out my hockey blog at hockeywiztalkshockey.blogspot.com. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram at hockeywiz777. Other key players who could be traded. Nick Leddy. Nick Leddy could be a key player on a contending team if he is dealt at the deadline. His value would definitely increase if he gets to play for a contending team, as his plus-minus would be much better. Hampus Lindholm. Hampus Lindholm is having a great season with Anaheim despite the team's struggle this season. A trade to a contending team would instantly boost his fantasy value, as his production would instantly increase. Marc Giordano. Marc Giordano is currently playing for a terrible Seattle Kraken team, so he is not worth owning in fantasy. But if he is traded to a contending team, he will be worth owning again. Dylan Strome. Dylan Strome may be traded at the deadline, which could actually make his fantasy value worse, because his fantasy value is very dependent on playing with Patrick Kane. And if he is traded to a team that doesn't have a player of that caliber for him to play with, then he could end up like how Ryan Strome was with the Oilers. Max Domi. Max Domi is one of the most fascinating players on the trade market because he is a very talented player, but it hasn't exactly translated into results in the past few years. He could become a prominent fantasy player if traded to a team that has a coach that knows how to maximize his talents. Mikko Koskinen. Mikko Koskinen is currently the starter for the Edmonton Oilers, but if he gets traded to a different team, his fantasy value will drop drastically. And if the Oilers acquire another starting goalie and he stays on the team, his value could also take a hit. I'm sure there will be more players moved at the deadline besides the players that I mentioned, but these were the most noteworthy players that I felt could see drastic change in fantasy value if moved to a different team. In my next podcast, I recap the NHL trade deadline.